Today, we're taking a look at some changes that I've made in my template node graph that are going to be reflected in this video as well as in future videos. And as always happens when you change your template node graph, there's also a subtle change to the way you think about and the way you approach color grading. So we're going to be talking about both of those things, as well as a few other upgrades or evolutions that have come about in my workflow that I want to share with you guys so you know what you're seeing as we move forward here on the channel. So let's dive right in and start by talking about this template node graph. Now, I've got my brand new template node graph here in front of me, and it may not look a world different from what we've already been doing here on the channel if you've been hanging out here on the channel for a while. Essentially, we've still got 5 nodes. 2 of these nodes are just placeholder secondary nodes down here in the secondaries branch of my node graph. This is a parallel layer mixer that I have here, and this branch down here is really for working my secondaries. It's a good sort of visual separator here in the node graph, as well as a good workflow because it allows me to do things like pull qualifiers or make power window adjustments that aren't going to be influenced or affected by whatever I'm doing up here in my primary stack. And it's really these 3 nodes where the meat of what I'm doing is going to continue to happen. Now, you might remember in its prior iteration, my template node graph also just had 3 nodes. In that prior iteration, those 3 nodes were exposure, ratio, and balance. Today, you can see I have something that I'm calling prime, balance, and saturation. So not a world of difference, but essentially what we're able to do here is get more functionality without adding nodes. That's one of the biggest magic tricks that you can pull off in color grading if you can figure out a way to add functionality without adding complexity. So let's take a look at how I'm thinking about this node graph, how I'm going to be operating in it going forward. So the big change is that we don't have separate exposure and ratio nodes, right? In the past, we've always had an exposure node where we explicitly adjust exposure, and then we've had a ratio node where we adjust our contrast ratio. The fundamental idea here is that we are combining those 2 things here in this primary node. So we are still working our exposure followed by our contrast ratio. We're still thinking about those as separate things, but we're simply combining all of them into one node. And there's a couple of reasons for this, but really the main one is that I find a lot of the time with the footage that I'm grading, I might not instinctively or immediately have a reaction that says, I need to adjust exposure. I might more quickly want to go into working my contrast ratio if the exposure is feeling pretty good overall. So I can have all those things parked in one node and not need to immediately tap onto a node and then tap right past that node if there's nothing for me to do there. So here with this one, if I want to hit my exposure, I can work my offset like I'm doing here, and then I can immediately go in and start working my lift and my gamma and my gain, and just preferentially adjusting my contrast ratio effectively. If I A/B that, that's looking pretty nice. It's softening the image out a little bit and getting me a little bit softer of a feel than I had before. Something else that I'll often be doing in this node here on the channel and that I'm doing in my professional practice a lot is you can right click on this prime node and set your composite mode to luminosity. And what that's going to do is ensure that when you make your exposure or your tonal adjustments, your contrast adjustments, your colors aren't going to change. Watch what happens to my vector scope when I select this composite mode. I get a little bit more color, and if I A/B where I was versus where I am now, this is essentially ensuring that my saturations and my colors don't change as much as I'm changing things like offset, lift, gamma, and gain. So that's the new process here. I still want you to think about exposure and contrast ratio as separate things. I still want you to prioritize exposure before you start thinking about contrast ratio, but I'd like you to try doing that all in one node as opposed to doing it in separate nodes because you're going to find, or at least you might find as I have, that it allows for a bit more efficient and a bit more intuitive of a process where you're freely flowing in between exposure and contrast ratio and really just shaping the tonality of your image all in one place. So that's the first major change here, okay? The balance node is really not going to change much at all. It's going to be the same basic idea. This is simply going to be a place where I can adjust the overall balance of my image. I have this node set to linear for its gamma, which allows me to apply linear gain and essentially allows me to get a bit of a cleaner balancing operation that feels evenly distributed across the bottom, middle, and top of the image, more so than if you were doing an offset adjustment. So that's kind of the logic there, but that's not really much of a change from what we've been doing here on the channel. And then the third node here in the top section of my node graph here, the primary section, is this saturation node. This is something we've done so much here on the channel and we talk about so much here on the channel that I thought it was time to actually implement it into the template node graph. And that is this saturation node, which has my color space, set to HSV, and my channels set to channel 2 only. Now, some of you guys may know, if you've hung out here on the channel for a while, I'm not the biggest fan of saturation. I think it actually is a distraction, and we often reach for saturation when we should be thinking for a bit longer about exposure, contrast ratio, or color balance. However, it still comes up all the time where we're like, all right, I've nailed those things, or I feel good about those things, and I do want to increase or decrease my saturation. That's where a saturation node comes into play. And this is the place where you can now, with this setup that we have here, do things like drive your gamma up and drop your gain down and really shape your saturation with a bit more dimension and a bit more of a filmic response than you're going to get simply by twisting your saturation up, okay? So that's the third node in this new template node graph. And as you can see, this is all at once kind of minor changes, but it actually changes the way that my grading process works quite a bit. So I want to encourage you to try this out, and I'm going to just fly through a couple clips here and show you how this new template node graph works in action as I go through here. So here's one where I want to open things up a little bit, and then just instinctively I want to go for my gamma and gamma things down. I'm grabbing my lift and going toward the right with that. And to be honest with you, it's even difficult to kind of narrate what I'm doing. I'm just going by feel and by eye and seeing what I like in this image. Like, that feels pretty nice to me. Same thing I'm going to do here as I did in the prior shot, composite mode, luminosity. Watch my vector scope as I make this change. It just pops back out a little bit. And again, I want to emphasize it's popping back out, but that's really just making it look more like it did before I began adjusting anything in this prime node. And this prime node's whole reason for existence is to adjust the tones of my image. I really don't want to affect my colors in terms of saturations or hues or balance or anything like that right now. I just want to affect tonality. So if I'm feeling like that's changing as I make those adjustments to offset, lift, gamma, or gain, then I'll often go in and flip that composite mode to luminosity in order to get that a little bit more consistent, okay? I'm gonna go over here to my balance and maybe move this just a little bit away from green and a little bit more toward cyan. Actually, I'm gonna try the opposite. I'm gonna go away from green, but a little bit more up into the kind of goldy vector, like so, before, after. That's nice, maybe not quite so much of it. And now this is another one where the saturation node is a good one that I'm glad that I had this one handy, because I am going to increase my saturation gamma a little bit just to get a little bit more color up in those leaves. Now, this is a good example too of somewhere where you want to be careful. I've talked about this in the past, but when you're driving your sat gamma in a preset sat node like we've got set up here in HSV with channel 2 turned on like so, you can get really, really pretty results that you're not going to be able to get any other way, but you also need to be careful that you don't go too far. Watch what happens if I go too far. I'm going to start to get things tearing up in the foliage up here and things looking kind of odd. So you want to be careful that you're not going too far and just hitting this the right amount. So something like that feels really nice, all right? And now I even want to go back to my primary node, and I feel like I could even soften out my shadows just a little bit more potentially, maybe something like that. And now I can go back over to my sat node and pull back that sat gamma a little bit more. And if I go before and after on this whole stack, that's looking really nice. Okay, let's take a look at this shot. Exposure, this is a great example. Exposure feels pretty good here. I'm ready to dive right into my contrast ratio. And because I'm in a node that does everything, I don't even have to switch nodes to do that. I can just immediately dive into working my overall ratio. If I go before and after, that's already looking really nice. I'm just lifting my lift and dropping my gamma a little bit to try to keep things deep, but also sort of rounded down there in the shadows. And in this case, I don't see much of a difference, but I am going to flip my composite mode to luminosity just to see what's changing. And I actually do think that that is in this case, change that I don't want to see, actually. If I go into luminosity mode versus where I was before, I am losing a little bit of saturation, but I kind of like that, so I'm going to let it ride for now. I'm going to go over here to my balance. Maybe I want to just pull a little bit away from red and a little bit toward like a greenish cyan, something like that. I'll turn this off and then on. And over here on my saturation node, I think my sat's pretty good, but never hurts to give it a little nudge. And that's not bad, right? Okay, so that's another example here with the template node graph. Now, before we go any further, I just want to give you a little bit of context for how I'm working here as well. I'm color managing in nodes. We've talked about that quite a bit here in the last few months here on the channel, but that's another change that I'm making going forward into 2024. All color management is going to happen in nodes here on the channel because I feel like it's easier to understand what's happening when you're working that way. And there are also some gotchas or some snags that you can encounter when you're color managing in your project settings that don't happen in quite the same way when you're color managing in nodes. It's a way of taking a bit more control over your process. So the way that's working is I'm taking advantage of Resolve's group function. And in this case, this shot came from an ARRI camera. So I have a group for it that's called log C3. It's already been assigned to this group. And because of that, it's getting an IDT, an input transform here that's taking me from my camera color space to my working color space, like so. And then I've got my grading happening here, which we were just doing. And then if we go over here to the timeline level, you can see I've got my output transform. Now, quick note on the output transform, small, but again, significant note of a change that's going to be happening here on the channel. Going forward, I'm going to be targeting gamma 2.2 for all of my color management because that makes the most sense for these videos when you guys are watching them. And I'm also going to encourage you guys, if you are mastering content for viewing on the web or for viewing on phones and laptops and iPads and things like that, gamma 2.2 is actually a better choice than gamma 2.4 in a lot of cases. So you might want to consider making that change as well. Now, if we're talking about traditional streaming or traditional broadcast or any situation where your deliverable is being stipulated to you as gamma 2.4, of course, you would want to continue to do that, as I will be, but for purposes of the channel and for your purposes, if you're creating web content, gamma 2.2 may be the better option, okay? I've also got a look happening here. This is a look that's coming from my Voyager LUT Pack. That's nothing new. That's something that we've been working with for quite some time here on the channel, but that's where the overall creative look for this entire timeline is coming from. And so that kind of rounds out what else is changing here in my project. One other thing that I will point out is in my project settings under my color management, I have my color viewer lookup table set to my macOS viewing transform. This is a free download that I'll leave a link to in the description for this video that you can grab. And it essentially ensures that I am getting the best reproduction that I can of my image on my built-in GUI display. Now, I would not recommend this for color critical work at all. I really recommend working on a calibrated reference monitor that you are outputting to from a dedicated output card. But I can tell you just even in an unscientific sort of way, when I look at my calibrated reference monitor here on my right, as opposed to my image here in my GUI on my left, they are much, much closer when I have my macOS viewing transform turned on. So definitely a good idea whether you are grading at more of a, sort of hobby level and you just want to get a more accurate image, or you're waiting and you're saving up for your reference monitor and you want to get the most accuracy that you can out of your Mac display. That's a great option for you. Like I said, I'll leave a link to the download in the description for this video. Okay, let's go forward and just take a look at a couple more shots and how we would work with them with this template node graph. So here's one where we do need to hit exposure, right? We're quite under in this shot. So I'm going to open quite a bit up, like so. And I'm not worried about the entire image looking perfect. I'm worried about getting my subject where I want to see her, somewhere like that. And now I'm going to go in and grab my lift, maybe combine that with my gamma, kind of play those two against each other. Maybe go and find my gain and just play with moving that both directions. And just start to feel my way through a primary adjustment that is really going to involve my offset, my lift, my gamma, and my gain all kind of working together because it's a big move, right? And what I might even do in a situation like this, if the image was still feeling like it needed more love than I could even give it here in my primaries, this is where I could either go over to my custom curves here or in my secondaries branch. I might just do it here and look at something like this foliage out here and tap it just to get a sense for where that's living. And now I'm going to option click here in my custom curves, and I'm just going to see if I can roll those things in a little bit. Now, something that you'll notice in the custom curves is that even though I've set that anchor point, and in my mind, I wouldn't expect things to move to the left of that anchor point, they do in Resolve. So what I'll often do is add a second anchor point to ensure that everything outside of the region that I want to implement a change in is holding steady, okay? So if we look at just this curves adjustment, we can see the result that we're getting there. That's maybe nice, maybe a little bit too much. I'm not so sure about that one quite yet, but you get the idea of how I might go about getting a little bit of a more finessed adjustment there in that area. I'm actually going to leave that off for now. Let's go over here to our balance. We've got some nice lush foliage that I don't want to lose, but I also don't want to feel like the entire image is being dragged into the green zone. So I'm just going to kind of move this around and see if I can't get happier with it. Maybe that's an improvement. Or maybe what we need to do is pair this with our saturation. So like this is a great example where I feel like this is a stronger basis for the image. or I'm just going a little bit more warm, a little bit more yellowy than I was before. It's like not quite so green washed as it was before, but I'm losing some saturation in that foliage. So oftentimes what you need in a situation like this is kind of a 1-2 punch, where you're going from your balance to your saturation, and we're going to get some of that lushness back over here in this sat node, like so. Again, I'm just working my gamma and my gain kind of intuitively. And another thing that we could do here if we wanted, something that I'm seeing as I start to flesh this out, like when I look at these two shots off, or these two nodes, I should say, off and then on, you can see how the net is that I'm kind of like holding that foliage, and the lushness in it is holding pretty well. I'm getting a nice bit of overall warmth, which feels good too. But like the level of color in the high end of the image and the bright end of the image is starting to feel like a little bit much to me. So what I'm going to do is go down here to my secondaries branch, and I'm going to go to my Lume versus Sat adjustment right here. And I'm going to take my peaks and drop them down like so that we're kind of losing saturation as we climb the tone scale. Can you see the difference there? Before, after. We've still got lots of life in that darker foliage and in our subject, but we're just kind of tapering off those saturations as we climb. That can be a really nice, filmy, classy thing to do to the image. I like what it's doing here. I feel like it's helping make the image feel a little bit more restrained and a little bit better rounded, even though we've still got lots of color and separation in the image that we didn't have before. If we look at where we were, even if I leave that exposure adjustment on, the image is feeling a lot nicer here, or rather here, than it was there, right? Okay, let's take a look at a couple more shots and see how it goes like on a shot like this. Exposure feels pretty good. I mean, maybe because of the, kind of atmosphere that's hitting the lens, I would want to stop down a little bit, or maybe that's just something I would want to hit with my lift or with my gamma. You can see in like preferential or in, kind of edge case situations like this where it's not always clear, you can kind of try both and be like, is it an offset thing? Is it a lift or a gamma thing? And just see what works better for you. Here's another thing that is a great thing to observe when you're grading. Sometimes you'll reach for your knobs and nudge things a couple, like inches to the left or to the right, and then you'll A/B and you'll realize like, wow, I haven't actually made much of a change, if any at all. That's a really good tell that you're happy with the image and nothing needs to change. So what I'll typically do in that situation is reset the node and move on, okay? Let's do one more shot here just for fun. I'm going to open this one up, even though I kind of like the moodiness of it. I think we could stand to have a little bit more stop. And I'm now going to bring my gain or my highlights down. I'm going to open up the bottom end of the image a little bit and maybe drop my gamma. Maybe do the opposite. Maybe open up the gamma and drop the lift. This is my favorite thing about working with lift, gamma, and gain. You've only got a couple of knobs. You can kind of feel them all in your hands at the same time. So you can just try stuff and you don't have to feel like you've got the answer before you even move the knob. You can just go in there and play with stuff and see what feels nice. And I think that's a nice improvement right there. Let's try our luminosity trick. Yeah, that's saving a little bit of the color that I was losing with that tonal adjustment. And now here with our balance, I'm going to try more of a preferential thing where I'm not trying to correct anything. I'm just feeling like I could get a little more character out of this image, in this case by kind of swinging it into this like cooler, moodier sort of register like that. I think that's really nice. Before, after. Before we were in a bit of kind of a magenta warm, and now we're in a bit more of a kind of cool cyan world that feels a little bit nicer. And let's just go to our saturation and see if there's anything in there that we want to do. I don't really think so. I feel like I kind of like the lower sat feeling in this case. So I'm going to leave that exactly where it is. Okay. All right. So I hope that gives you a good kind of taste for how this new template node graph works for me in my hands and for some of the reasons why I feel like it is a benefit to my practice, both in terms of efficiency and in terms of like giving me a bit more of an intuitive relationship with my image, because I can work all the tonal stuff in one place in that primary or in that prime node, as well as the ability to go in and make that HSV saturation that we're so fond of here on the channel without needing to create it as a separate node every single time I want to do that, because it comes up a lot when I'm grading and it can be really handy to have it built right into the template node graph. So I hope you enjoyed this walkthrough, as well as checking out some of these other changes that I showed you here in the video. These changes are going to be where we're living for the foreseeable future here on the channel. My grading practice is always evolving and changing and shifting, and I try to keep you guys kind of like in the loop on that as my thinking is evolving. But for the time being, this is a pretty good kind of like state of the union of where things are sitting currently. So you don't necessarily have to adopt any or all or any of the ideas that I've shown you here today, but I would definitely encourage you to give them a try and see if it doesn't help you think about your grades in a different way or get some results that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise.